girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever, and then were asked what the reaction was from them, and the results are very much the same. There's quite a bit of curiosity, quite a bit of acceptance and understanding, quite a bit of it not being an issue in the slightest. For both men and women, there were some negative reactions and some shock, but overall, the significant others, when being told that essentially their mate would have inclinations to fall in love with a being which some people would say is so much less than them, their reactions were surprisingly positive, at least according to the Zoophiles themselves. Again, not having the significant others' reactions directly, I can't really say. But if you watched my video on the goat or who is Sylvia, you can see in there what I figured would be a more likely reaction. A lot of anger, a lot of feeling of betrayal. But, apparently, the data doesn't bear that out, at least with this small sample. So, again, it's a matter of trust, but if you trust your partner to essentially not make a big deal of it, this data is encouraging in that it makes it seem more likely that they're not going to make a huge issue out of it. Alright, so then the participants were asked whether they would or would not allow others to have sex with their animals. And most of them, both men and women, said they would, but only under certain restrictions. Only certain people they trust, or in certain situations, under certain guidelines. It was provisional, their willingness to allow this to happen. Some would allow it, and some would not at all. But again, for both men and women, it was conditional. They would if certain precautions were taken. Now here there's also some data on the few people who had what either forced or initiated others into having sex with animals. Nobody forced anybody to do it. But a significant number of men and one woman did initiate somebody to it. And the one woman did it with her significant other, so say of that what you will. And as for the men, most of them who did it for people they met on the internet or friends. Alright, so then there was a question of how the animal feels about sex with humans in general. And there were various answers, but again, both men and women made the claim that the animals had positive experiences with sex. There were some who said that basically it depends on the animal and the situation, and it varies depending on that. But overall, almost nobody said that it was a negative experience for the animal, in general. Now, men and women were asked whether they forced an animal to have sexual relations, and the women said no, which is unsurprising considering, how would they? But the men, most of them said no. Those who said yes, most of them said they had only done it in the past and wouldn't do so again. But it does happen. And that is a serious animal abuse issue because, well, you're raping somebody or something. So that needs to be dealt with. But at the same time, we see that, at least according to their own testimony, and again, I can't verify the veracity of it, they don't tend to want to rape an animal, and they don't tend to actually do it. Or if they did it in adolescence when they were foolish and didn't think about the consequences for the animal quite as deeply as they do now. Then the participants were asked to sort of define themselves, using the terms which are thrown about by the zoosexual community, zoophile and bestialist. Most of them identified as zoophiles, both men and women. There were quite a number of men who also identified as both a bestialist and a zoophile, which makes sense considering they have sex with animals and they have a genuine love or affection for them. Women didn't cross-identify that much, but again, zoophile was the label of choice among them. When we look at their actual answers and match them to the definitions Miletski gives, that is, bestialist is someone who has sex with animals, and zoophile is somebody who has genuine love or affection for them, the numbers increase for both bestialists and zoophiles. In the case of both men and women, the vast majority, by those definitions, are both bestialists and zoophiles. Some of them were only bestialists, but that's not the most typical behavior. The men and women were then asked whether bestiality is a perversion. And if not, why not? And if it is, why? And both, unsurprisingly, both men and women stated in overwhelming numbers that it's not a perversion, and quite a few of them thought that it was natural, or just like any other sexual orientation. There were those who also claimed that it is a perversion because it's not the norm, or because it's somehow wrong, and some were indecisive on the issue. But the men and women in this sample who have sex with animals, what a shock, don't consider it wrong to do so, or don't consider it perverse in any way which is serious to them. The participants were then asked how their lives would be different if they had intimate relationships with human beings. And basically, the participants had to be cut into two segments in order to ask this question fairly, because some of them had sexual relationships with human beings, and some of them had no such relationships. So first we move on to the men and women who had such relationships. And a lot of them say basically nothing about how it would be different other than they've done it before and that's it. A lot of them seem to think that there would be negative consequences or no real difference. And other than that, the people who have actual experience with human beings didn't really see any specific changes. They just felt that it wouldn't really make any difference in their lives whether they had such a relationship with a human being or not, or if they had one, it would end badly for them. And of course, more of them also said nothing about their opinions on the matter, other than that, they've done it before, so why not? Now, with men who don't have intimate relationships with human beings, there was a wide variety of answers. Basically, the men and women were pretty much undecided on what consequences would happen, whether they were positive or negative, or whether they would only enter into such a relationship if the person involved accepted them as a zoophile. And that's true of men. Of women, well, most of them thought that there would be positive consequences to that. There were a few in both men and women who said that they didn't want such a relationship, but it's hard to know how genuine that is. And finally, the men and women in this study were asked how having sex with animals has changed their lives. And men and women cited positive changes and environmental adjustments and changes as most important to them. Some of them cited no change, and some of them complained that they had to live a life of secrecy. But overall, they don't think that the animal sex impacts them in any meaningful way which requires them to somehow reform. So that's it for this video. I will be splitting it into parts, obviously, because it's a very long one. But next time, we'll wrap this up by looking into the actual research question of whether there is a sexual orientation towards animals or not. This is the Erudite Kind of File signing off.